Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we're going to get into tradition and connection. But before we do that, I want to make a quick announcement about the Frankie and Jess podcast. So a lot of our listeners are probably from the Salt Lake area, being that the Frankie and Jess show on 97.1 ZHT is kind of how we got our start. That's how I found Mark,
Right.
and that is, and I
right.
approached him, and that's how we got this podcast started. And the Frankie and Jess podcast, I mean, they announced our podcast on the air, right? And so they really helped us get the word out there.
Yeah.
Well, in April of last year, they got let go pretty suddenly from their radio station that they had been on for, 20 years. Frankie,
over 20 years. That's a long time.
Yeah, I think Frankie 25 years and Jess 18 when they got let go. So they decided to start their own podcast. So if you go to listentofrankieandjess.com, then you can find a link. You kind of scroll down and you can find links to their podcast. So I will have that linked in our show notes as well. I will have that URL. So you can go listen to them and hear just their whole story. It's a pretty cool story. And, it's great if you're going through trauma or if you've recently been let go or if you were in a toxic work environment. Really good episode to check out because that's kind of where they were at, and they go into that a lot. So if you want to listen to that, that'll be there. All right. So why are we doing connection and tradition together? Because they kind of seem like they would be separate, but they're closely related. They're tied together. So
I think they're tightly linked. I really, as I thought about it, I think they're really connected. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, everybody can think of, when you say the word tradition, a lot of different things are going to come to mind for different people, right? You think of family traditions, a lot of them probably surrounding the holidays or birthdays, right? Events. So,
right.
And, family traditions or maybe even cultural traditions. So, and then connections are what can happen as a result of this tradition. So that's kind of why we linked these, is because tradition really creates connection, right? And so if you think about, if you have this big tradition, I mean, I know one that really comes to mind is the Pride Parade. That's this really big event. And, when people come together and they feel a connection, right? They feel connected because they're a bunch of like-minded people. And so that's why we're doing this together, is because they really are so closely linked. So I want to start with traditions and why traditions matter, both for couples and families. So what are your thoughts on this, Mark?
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons that they matter. They tend to create meaning in our lives, and they provide structure and stability. I don't know why this memory comes back, but it's one that I have pretty strongly. It's about Christmas growing up in my home. And this is not going to seem like a tradition, but it really fits for me. Christmas, and we kept all the Christmas stuff in this one big box. And it was a very big box. And you probably need, several people to bring this thing up. I don't know why they kept it in one big box. But I remember the tradition of pulling it up and unpacking it. And that was always a huge deal for me as a kid. I just loved it. And, because we take out the same things every year. So for me, that fits with tradition. That they're always, I won't go into detail about what they are, but I still remember them. And like the ornaments, I still remember the ornaments on the tree. And so that type of tradition, I guess one word you could say, it provides continuity, meaning that, it gets passed down. I certainly don't have any of those decorations. They're probably long gone. But the idea of pulling out the Christmas decoration is still a pretty big deal for us. And I notice it for my grandchildren. And And I remember we used to go to my maternal grandparents on Christmas Eve. That was always the tradition. And they had these certain things that they would do. My grandfather would hide coins, money around. And so we try and do those same things for our grandkids. Now that's certainly Christmas. Tradition. Another tradition I have is Josh, my youngest grandson, is having a birthday tomorrow. He's turning 8, and I make a birthday cake for all of every time one of the kids has a birthday. And so that has turned into a tradition that they all count on. And they all get to know that they get to choose what they want for their birthday cake. So it moves from generation to generation. I think that's one reason that traditions are important, and it creates that connection, as you said. I think, I was thinking about, you remember the book we say, Robin Smith, Lies at the Altar. There is a section on asking your potential partner, what type of traditions do you have? How do you celebrate birthdays? How do you celebrate holidays? And I think the reason is that it's not that you're going to necessarily follow the same traditions, but if you grew up in a home where there were traditions, you're going to want to have some sort of traditions in your home. And I would guess that's true for you and Curtis, possibly, that you created your own traditions, as you brought those two mini cultures, yours and his, together. Did you create?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So I think one of my favorite traditions is around birthday. And so every year, the night before their birthday, we decorate. And, we put up streamers and balloons, and there's always a theme. We let them pick the theme, right? And then, so when they wake up the morning of their birthday, and there's this celebration right away. It's the first thing when they wake up. And so that's definitely one of the favorite traditions that I've started. And then another tradition that I can think of is that, was in my family, that Curtis and I continue, was going to church every Sunday. And that doesn't maybe seem like a tradition to some people, but it's a tradition to me because, religion is such a big part of mine and Curtis's lives. And so a lot of our traditions and our family rituals are shaped around our religion. And, and it doesn't have to be something religious, or it doesn't have to be, I don't know, even a holiday. It can be any sort of a tradition. Like maybe every year your family goes on a vacation. That's a tradition, right?
Right.
And again, and so traditions are all about connection, and it's all about togetherness. Right. And so it's something that the kids can look forward to, that they can talk about. You're making memories. And it's, I think that element of anticipation, kids love that.
Yeah. You bring up a really good point. And that is that religion does offer, for a lot of people, I mean, it certainly offers structure, but the way you talk about tradition, that is certainly true with a lot of religions and a lot of things that we do within religions. And so when let's say you aren't a part of a religious group, then those traditions in your home give you the same type of thing.
Yeah.
That structure and stability. So it's true, you don't have to be a part of a religion, but I think that's what one of the major things that religion does do for people. And so, when you talk about the tradition of going to church every Sunday, I think that entirely fits, and especially for your kids, because they know this is what the family does, and you connect in a different way when you're there. But you can also do the same thing at home, often with holidays, but birthdays, certainly, to do that. But it doesn't need to be anything special. I think we'll talk about connections with couples in a minute, and how it kind of fits the tradition. I guess, do you call it a tradition or a ritual? I suppose there's what's the difference in those two words? I haven't really thought about it, so
I haven't
threw
either.
that question out.
Yeah, but it's a good question, because I can think of, you might call it, and I don't know, maybe it is both, but it's definitely falls into that ritual of connection that Curtis and I have. And again, it centers around religion, but it's applicable, and it could be considered either. And that when we pray together as a couple, we kiss after we pray. And so, that was, I guess you could maybe call it a rule, right? Or something, but that's something that we established very, very early on in our marriage, but it's something that we do that we just, that again, it's about that connection. And
Right.
so, I mean, could it be considered a tradition for us? Yeah, but it's also could be a ritual of connection.
Right. And so I don't know that we should, worry about the words
Yeah.
because a lot of these words are interchangeable. But I remember we have talked about William Doherty, who he does a lot of research around marriage. And I think he does
Hmm.
some marriage counseling himself. But for, many years ago, I think I heard him speak at a conference here in Salt Lake, and he brought up this idea of ritual of connection. So that's the
Yep.
first place that I heard that term. And the way he talks about it, he thinks it should happen every night. Now,
Hmm.
nothing's going to happen every night because
Right.
our lives are busy. But he talks about it in terms of, you sit together, and this is all about connection with the couple. Maybe you have a drink to get. I mean, if you were a wine drinker or tea, you can
Hmm.
have some herbal teas that will keep you awake. But something that you are making together and doing together, you should sit down and connect. And so he would call that the ritual connection. And I talk to most of my couples about that it's really important. And what I find nowadays is with a lot of, and I'm seeing couples who are struggling, I acknowledge that.
Hmm.
But one of the things that is pretty common between these couples that are struggling is they don't take time to connect.
Yeah.
So this idea of doing it as often as you can. Now, you and Curtis do it in your certain way every night, or yeah, probably every night,
Hmm.
as
Yeah.
far as the prayer and things like that. Lindy and I do it most every night, connect just at the end of the day, we get together. I mean, it could be, well, actually, since we're empty nesters,
Hmm.
we have a lot of time to do this. So in the evening, we'll do a very light exercise together. We're in the same room when we do that.
Hmm.
She's on a treadmill and I'm on a recumbent bike. And then we'll come we have an office here at home, and I might do my cross stitch and she's doing crochet. And
Hmm.
then we may listen to a book or we'll just talk. And that happens almost every night where
Hmm.
we're spending time together. And so that is a ritual of connection. And I would really suggest strongly to couples that they figure out a way to get that connection often. It's what's missing in a lot of marriages. And I would say almost entirely missing from the couples that I see who are struggling. They just don't take the time to be together.
Right. And it doesn't have to be elaborate and it doesn't have to
No,
take very long. Even if
no,
it's
right.
just 5 minutes every day, if that's all your schedule allows for on, an everyday kind of basis,
Hmm.
then, great. Take whatever you can get. But hopefully you are setting aside time regularly, ideally once a week, but a minimum to just be a couple to connect, usually
Hmm.
like a date night or something longer than just that 5 minutes. So Curtis and I went to this marriage clinic that was put on by a friend of ours. And one of the questions that was asked is, how often do couples need to connect? And so, and, and what,
That's an interesting question. The need to connect.
right. Well, or how often should they connect? Right. And so so part of this clinic that we went to, it was maintaining connection through the years
Hmm.
is what the goal of this clinic was, this kind of workshop that we went to. And so, it was, and the interesting thing is, so there was three couples, Curtis and I, and then two other couples, and the other two couples in there didn't have kids. And so our answers were interesting because, I think I was the first one to answer. And I said, well, I like to try to connect with Curtis at least once a day, even if it's just for 10 to 15 minutes. Right. And for us, with him working from home, that's pretty easy to do. I
Yeah.
mean, because I can often just go into his office and we can just sit and talk about things. Right. But, I said at least once a day, I like for us to be connecting just because, the hustle and bustle, the busy of our lives with kids, it's so easy to neglect that relationship,
So I
and then,
agree with that. I just want you to say that would be my answer.
yeah, at least,
At least once a day.
yeah, at least once a day.
At
And
least once.
so these other two couples said for them, they kind of thought about it and they said, yeah, I think I would, and they actually had to define what it means to have a connection
Hmm.
because, and interestingly enough, both of these couples work together. And so, they drove to work together every day. And so they were spending a lot of time together. And so they kind of had to think about it and define, well, what is it to connect? What does it mean to connect? Like, because yeah, we spend almost all of our time together, but are we actually connecting when we're alone? And so I think that's something else for couples to be aware of because you can be in a car together and not be connecting at all. You can have a 30-minute drive and have absolutely zero connection in that car ride. And not that you need to spend every car ride having some deep connection, right? But, I think if you're a couple that spends all of their time together or, works together, then I think that's something you need to be thinking about is, are we finding ways to actually connect deeper on a deeper level than just, you know, we work together and we're together all the time?
Right. And so Lindy and I work together, and we often drive together, but not always. And so we have to make an effort to not talk about our cases at work, which we
Yeah.
do, given that we're in the same agency. And so, and we have cases that, she may see one person, I may see the couple, things like that. So it's really important to find time, like even if you work together, you have to focus on non-work issues. And I've certainly seen couples who do that, who work together, and it is they really need to make a conscious effort to pull back.
Hmm.
We are not going to talk about work. We're going to connect doing something else. So the other thing is you can, if you do have children, often the connection is typically only around the kids,
Yeah.
and which is important. And I'm not saying you don't do that. It's just you need other interests as well. Now
Hmm.
that becomes easier certainly once you're in my situation, older, when our kids are grown, we have grandkids, but still you need to connect around other things. I think at least once a day.
Yeah.
And again, as I said earlier, I think it's one of those common themes that I see in couples who are struggling is that
Hmm.
they don't do that. They don't take the time. Here's the interesting thing. For most of them, they do have time. They're just doing something else. Like they'll
Hmm.
get on their computers or they'll get on social media or they'll
Yeah.
turn on the TV. They might even be watching because they don't like the same show. One may be
Yeah.
upstairs, one may be downstairs. And so the other thing I suggest to couples who might be listening, really think about how you're spending your time in the evening.
Hmm.
And what I found is I don't think I've ever found where there isn't 15 minutes that you could find
Yeah.
to connect. You just have to be intentional about it
Right.
and say, okay, we're going to do this. And that's why I think it fits whether you want to use the word ritual, you want to use the word tradition, it
Yep.
doesn't matter. But if you start making a habit, that's
Hmm.
essentially what you're doing is making a habit of doing it. And so every night we've been doing this for many, many years, Lindy and
Yeah.
I. And so it's just something that is, I guess the expectation is there, but we just do it because that's
Hmm.
our habit.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be complicated. You don't have to be doing anything. You could just be
No.
talking.
Right.
So, so I have, and this is, I guess you might call it psychology according to Liz, right? Or
Okay.
marriage
Great.
according to Liz. Okay. So I have kind of determined in my own mind that, every couple has, every long-term couple has kind of three components to their relationship, kind of three aspects that they need to be good at. So they need to be good romantic partners. So,
Hmm.
everything good lovers, right? They
Hmm.
need to
Hmm.
be good coworkers, right? And that they're running a home together, and they need
Right.
to be good friends, right? So
Hmm.
there are these three categories that kind of basic categories in a relationship that you have to work on all of them because they are all equally important, right? I mean, the romantic, the emotional, the sexual, that's all a very important part of your relationship. But so is being a coworker. You're running a household together, you're managing something, and you need to learn to be able to work together, but you can't neglect your friendship. And so often, especially parents with young kids, they neglect the friendship. They're really
Yes.
good at that coworker aspect. And maybe even they're okay at the lover aspect because they're pretty regular in their sexuality, but they neglect the friendship. And so that's part of what connecting is. It can really help facilitate being just friends, because I think it's important to remember to be just friends in a marriage.
Well, and as John Gottman found in his research, he says this all the time, friendship is the basis of intimacy. And so I think he would say that you've got to have that so that you can build on the other aspects that you brought about. There's a book there, Liz. You ought to, Marriage According to Liz.
Marriage According to Liz.
There's the title.
All right, you want to co-write it with me? Let's write a book.
Well, let's write it. Marriage According to Liz. So yes, people neglect their friendship. At a couple today talking about because they have kids, they not forgot, but they just don't take the time to plan dates. You need to still date.
Yeah.
Which is the time where, like, if you think about everybody who's a couple, I think I can make that general statement. At one time, we're dating.
Yeah.
And they were behaving in a different way. And often I say, go back and look at how were you behaving back then? Mm-hmm. And what aspects of that, now you're different people, you have kids, I get that. But what aspects of that behavior can you bring into the current relationship? What are the things that you're missing? Because sometimes, I'll use the word lazy, I think sometimes, and maybe it's not lazy, maybe we're just tired, because life gets busy. So I'll take back that word. But you still have to, even though you're tired, you still have to make a conscious effort to do some of those things, which, you brought up you used the word romantic. And romance means different things to different people. And so you have to understand, what does my partner find romantic? And let your partner know what you find romantic and do some of those romance things. I hear that all the time. Typically from wives, sometimes from husbands as well. But I think it's one of those things that fits into what we call that emotional connection. And so, and you have to have that emotional connection, which, is about being friends. Remember the reason that you got together in the first place.
Yes.
There's a reason that you got married. And sometimes we forget that. And so dating or working on your friendship helps you remember the reason you got together. And so that is the connection. You need to go back and, remember, we connected in this way, 20 years ago. And so we should try connecting that way again.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is all about, the dialogue. You got to talk about it, right? You got to bring it up. Okay. So now I talked about this marital clinic that Curtis and I went to. So I have kind of a funny story that went with this that I think you'll appreciate. So, but first I want to pose this question to you.
Okay.
And just to see what you think. Are deep conversations necessary to have emotional closeness?
Well, do you want my answer?
Yes.
I mean, I have an answer.
Yes.
My answer is no.
No. Okay.
Why? They aren't necessary, because I think people misunderstand the idea of emotional connection. I guess, we could get into detail of what you define as deep emotional connection. Okay. But I think that mostly emotional connection is about, I think I've said this before, one, being aware of what's going on, of your own internal emotions, being aware of it, having a language in which you can talk about it or describe it, and then being willing to share it. And so I think that connection can just be, hey, I'm feeling really sad today. This happened at work. That now, in my mind, that's not a deep emotional connection. It's just a sharing of, here's where I am emotionally. Now, you can have deep emotional connection. Yes. I mean, I think you can. I don't think it's necessary to have.
Okay, so Curtis is going to love your answer.
What's your answer?
I said yes. Okay, so
probably most wives are going to say yes, and probably most husbands are going to say no.
Right.
That's
okay.
Probably part of your story.
It is. Okay, so we did this really fun exercise where they separated the husbands and the wives. We were in the same room, and the husbands were asked a set of questions, and the wives were not allowed to talk. We couldn't talk at all. And then we switched places and kind of did the same thing. And they asked this question, And Curtis's first answer was no. And I thought he was just doing this funny thing that he does because he does this to me all the time. Maybe it's a tradition is he says no. Like that's just kind of a funny thing he does. And it started from he just likes the shock value of telling people no to an obvious question. Like
Okay.
the very first time I was at his house when we were dating is I said, "Hey, can I use your bathroom?" And he looks at me, he goes, "No."
No.
And I go, "Where is it?" And he loved that, right? And he just loved that I didn't take him seriously. Anyways, so it's kind of become this running joke between us. And so I thought that's what he was doing.
Uh,
And then I found out that he actually meant it. He's like, "No." And I'm just sitting here in my head like, "Wait a second." And by the way, it was two women married women who put on this workshop. And so
uh,
sorry, Curtis is chiming in. He's
is he there?
yeah, he can hear us. Oh, anyways, okay.
Well, tell
So
him I had the same answer.
Mark had the same answer. Anyways, and so this other guy said, I guess it depends on how you define deep conversations. And he went on to
Right.
talk about like what's the meaning of life, right? Or,
Yeah.
like these deep, deep conversations. And like you, Curtis took the question very literally. And I went back to the person who put on this workshop. She's a good friend of mine. Her name's Erica. And I said, "What is the exact wording? Because I want to try this again. I want to
Uh-huh.
ask this question and see what he says." Because what they are getting at is, and this is kind of some feedback that they got is the rewording of this question. Because, are deep conversations necessary? Like, and maybe a better way to pose this question is, can you have emotional closeness without having these deep conversations, right? So like, can you have a intimate relationship with somebody if you've never had deep conversations? Does that
Well,
make sense?
I still think you have to define what that means.
Right.
It's somewhat ambiguous, using the terms because if you have
Mm-hmm.
a deep emotional conversation to me is probably going to be different than a deep emotional
Yeah.
conversation to you. So that's one
Yep.
of the problems with the question. I think that, I mean, what do you think about my idea that to me, emotional connection is
Mm-hmm.
all about being willing to share and talk about your own emotional experience. That's how I define emotional connection,
Yeah, or emotional closeness. And
emotional closeness. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and I agree with you. I think that you can be emotionally close and it doesn't have to involve a deep conversation. But I can't have an emotional closeness or I can't have emotional connection with some random person off the street, right? Without
Well,
first
that's
having
true.
some sort of a
Yeah.
deep, like, but if I have some sort of like a deep, good, like, an in-depth conversation, then I might feel this emotional connection to someone. And so that's kind of what they were getting at is part of connecting is being vulnerable and is being willing to share things.
See, I think that's it. I just
Yeah.
thought we need to bring up the word vulnerability
Yeah. Yeah.
because, for instance, the person that you meet on the street, you shouldn't be anyway
No.
vulnerable with them.
Uh-huh.
There's some people who are, which is a whole different problem. But you shouldn't be vulnerable with just the person on the street. But so vulnerability,
Yes.
I think it's an important word. I'm glad you brought it up.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is something I would add to
Mm-hmm.
my definition of emotional connection, or is that you've got to be vulnerable, and that's generally hard for a lot of couples, harder for men. I don't
Mm-hmm.
think we do a good job of teaching men that it's okay to be vulnerable. When I see couples, I try and help them understand, especially the males, I try and help them understand you're only being vulnerable with your partner here, your
Yeah.
spouse.
Yeah.
You do not need to be vulnerable with the guys you work with.
Mm-hmm.
That's different. And so I think in response to your question,
Mm-hmm.
if you're vulnerable and if you're willing to share your emotion, I think that what happens is on occasion you will go into a deep, what I might consider a deep emotional conversation.
Yeah.
I think that will happen.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that it's not going to happen all the time, but it will. I'm
Yeah.
pretty sure it will. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I agree with both sides. I mean, I think in order to have emotional closeness, there has to be vulnerability,
Yeah.
but you don't need vulnerability every time to have emotional closeness.
Right. Right.
So,
I
I
agree.
mean,
But
yeah,
there are times when you do need to be vulnerable.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't think you can have an intimate relationship without some sort of vulnerability.
And the other thing I try and help couples think about is when I ask that question, what was it like back 20 years ago when you were dating?
Mm-hmm.
Most of them agree that they were more vulnerable back then. And it's always curious to me how that changes. And I think that it could be just tiredness. It could be, I don't know what it is except for tiredness. Because most couples end up having kids and their lives get busy. Most couples are true career couples now. And so their stresses. So I think it's the stress. That's what it is as I'm thinking about it. I think the stress in our lives leads us to be less vulnerable as we progress through long-term relationships. That's what I think. Mm-hmm. So you have to really make an effort to get that vulnerability back.
I was just thinking, man, that could be an entire podcast episode.
Yeah, I think it could be. Yeah. Stress, every couple, I ask every couple who comes in, what is your level of stress, either at home or at work or in the relationship? And there are different ways that we experience stress. And the sad thing, almost consistent thing, though, there is a lot of stress in couples, and it negatively affects the relationship. There's no way it can.
And you can't avoid stress because that's just not life.
No, you can't avoid it. You just have to manage it.
Yeah. You need to find effective coping mechanisms for stress. Yeah.
But I think that what a lot of couples forget is that having the connection, so we go back to I think having the connection on a regular basis helps decrease the stress, and in itself is a coping technique, I believe.
Yeah. All right. So in conclusion, I do want to mention one thing that is a great tool for helping couples to connect, and that's Gottman's card deck.
Yeah, so I like that.
Yeah, so it's a free app. You can go on to the App Store or Google Play Store, depending on what device you use, and you just search Gottman's card deck, and you'll see it, and it's a free app. It's got tons of questions that are great for just date nights, or if you just need that 5 minutes of connection, every day you can just say, all right, let's do our card deck question real quick, and just
I think it's a great resource.
Really it really is. All right, so next week we are going to get into disagreeing agreeably. So it's an election year. So
okay. Is that where that's coming from? Okay.
Yes, we're going to talk about you don't have to agree with somebody to get along.
Well, that's right. That's right.
So that's kind of where the basis of this episode is going to come from. And I promise you, don't tune out. We're not going to go. Mark and I are not going to get political.
No,
we're
on opposite ends of the spectrum, but I think our listeners know that.
They do. And that's part of why this is going to come up, is because we've been able to talk about politics before. Yeah. So
we talk about it offline. We typically leave politics out of the podcast. But our listeners should know we often talk about it.
Yeah. And it's all about finding common ground. So
or just accepting that we can think differently about things.
Yes. Well, I guess, can we skip next week's episode too?
No. We'll go into more detail.
Yes, we will. All right. We will see you all next week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.